All right, I know you watched a video about the box model, but I'm going to show you one more time because it's really important that you get the idea of how it works. I have an HTML document. It's fairly simple. The only thing I've added is a title called the box model, and I've linked to a style sheet, and my style sheet doesn't have anything in it yet. But I'm going to go ahead and make an ID, and it's going to be called green box. And I'm going to put some information in it. So I'm going to give this green box a width of 300 pixels, and I'm going to give it a height of 300 pixels. And I want to see this box on my screen, so I'm going to give it a background color of green. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to go back to my source code, and I'm going to add that box into my HTML by going div ID equals, and it's green box. And I'm going to say content of green box goes here. I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to look at it on my screen, and you can see that I have a green box, and it's 300 pixels wide and it's 300 pixels tall. So when we look at that green box and we start talking about width and height in the box model, we need to look at the other items that affect how big this item is. The first one being padding. So if I put in a padding of 50 pixels, what that does is it puts padding around the entire object. And so the padding is inside the box, and it's 50 pixels. There's 50 pixels right now around the entire box of padding, which has now increased the size of my object from the default of 300 pixels by 300 pixels to having 50 on each side and 50 on the top and the bottom, which has made my height and my width 400 by 400. So any item that goes inside this box model affects the height and the width. So even though it looks like my height and my width is 300, the padding is adding 100 to both the height and the width. Now, the next thing we have is margin. And if I make my margin 50 pixels as well, my margin is what happens outside of my box. So now you can see that outside of the box, I have 50 pixels on the left, the top, the right, and the bottom. And so now, instead of my box being 300 by 300, it is actually 500 by 500 because I've added 100 pixels of padding and 100 pixels of margin on each side. Now the last item in the box that affects your box model is called the border. And so within this border, I'm going to type in the border property, which is called border. And I'm going to make it 5 pixels. And I'm going to make it dashed. And I'm going to make it the color black. And I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go back. And now you can see that I have a border around my box. So now, not only do I have a 300 by 300 box called green box, but I also have 50 pixels of padding, 5 pixels of the border, and 50 of the margin, which means that I have, instead of my width being 300, my width is 300 plus 100 plus 100 plus 10. So my width is now 300, 400, 510, and so is my height. So your box model takes into consideration all of these items. Now let's look at another example. I'm going to go back to my CSS, and now I'm going to make another box. Instead of green, I'm going to make a blue box. And I'm going to make sure that the background color is blue. And we'll see, we'll make it the same one. But I need to go back to my HTML, and I need to code in my blue box. So div ID equals blue box. And I'm going to say content of blue box goes here. So now I have a blue box as well. Now notice when you're doing the border or the padding, you can do, or the margin, you have the ability. So if I go to my styles, I don't have to, if I just do padding and I say 50 pixels, it does 50 pixels around the entire box. However, I do have the ability to say padding left equals 20 pixels. And so now what that's done is it's just put padding on the left side of this box, and that's it. So if I have this one, so now my width of this box is going to be 300 plus 50 on each side, which makes 400, but then only 20 on the left, which is just 20 pixels. So now it's 420, and then the border is 10, so it's 430. So when you guys are working with your boxes and creating layouts for web pages, you need to make sure that you write down everything on a piece of paper. Sketch out what your actual box size is, the height and the width, and then make sure you put in your margins or your padding or your border, and those all take up the whole width. If I right click on this and I inspect it, you can see that this is what the box model looks like. So here is my actual box, which is 300 by 300. Then it shows that I have padding around it, which is 50. It also shows that my border is 5 and that my margin is 50. If I go to this element and I inspect it, you can see that it looks a little different. The padding just shows 20 on this side. So whenever you inspect an item, it will show you all of the pieces that make up that actual box. And that's all for this video. I just wanted to show you how the box model worked with your padding and margins. A lot of times you're going to use borders for your items just to add a little division between them. And your margin is around the outside of it to give it a little bit of a space. And the inside, which is the padding, usually you add padding to give a little bit of breadth or space between your border. So it doesn't look quite as cramped as you can see it does here in this blue box. So in order to make boxes or layout items, you can just use these div tags. I could make another one called yellow box as well. And my yellow box, I'm going to give the exact same properties as my green box, except I'm going to make it the background color be yellow. And then in my source code, I'm going to give another div, and it's going to be called yellow box. I'm going to save that. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to refresh. And now I have a yellow box as well, except it needs to say on my source code, content of yellow box goes here. So now I've got all 3 of these boxes that are on my pages to show you how the box model works. Now, in this example, I'm using these IDs that I've called green box, blue box, and yellow box. But please note that we already have some of these elements defined. So you know how we have footer? That looks like this, right? So you can give your footer, even though it doesn't have a pound sign because it's not ID, it's one of those general elements that we've already looked at. So we can give our footer widths and heights. We also can give our nav these box model items as well. And we can do the same thing with our main. And when we format these and we give it heights and widths and paddings and margins, we do not have to put the pound sign before the item because these are already defined in HTML5. And that's all for the introduction on the box model, and we will talk now about normal flow in the next tutorial.